success, not long-term success. People don't think in terms of, a 10-year horizon. In fact, the whole political system set up in North America is sort of 2-year cycles in both the United States and Canada. The Soviets, for example, at the time, were really heavily into 7-year plans. That was their whole enterprise, was to plan agriculture, plan all their things they were doing for 7 years, which seemed to me to be a much more reasonable thing to do. I wonder what happened to this thing.
One of the cords maybe? Because it sort of flickered before it went out.
Anyway, to get back to my story. I was really, not because I was in favor of communism at all, even though I was somewhat of a closet socialist. Because my family had come from what was in the Soviet Union, and I was receiving all this Soviet propaganda in the mail. Because my father was a wanted man by the Soviets. They wanted to send him to Siberia, and so they were still trying to get him to come back so they could send him away. But anyway, I kept seeing all this Soviet propaganda, this explanation of how great the Soviet Union is and how their agriculture is thriving because of the collective and all this other stuff. So I don't know if that influenced me into thinking about architecture and that whole idea of how long should one plan. But that became sort of a fascination, and that's what I did all my research in, and when I did my thesis. And in my thesis, I also started looking at the relationship between human organizations and biological entities, and architecture and biological entities, and human organizations and architecture. And I began to see, as I read more and more management books and books about organizational theory and so on, that there was a parallel track where management, people who were involved in sort of the theory of management, theory of organization, were also looking at the model of biological organisms. And so I put those two things together, and I thought, well, if I study how organizations are born, how they thrive, and then they decline, and then they die, I might get a glimpse into, where's that? A glimpse into a parallel kind of situation with architecture. And I sort of saw an overlay there. And so what I did was, I spent a whole year reading about organization theory and systems approach and all this other stuff. And I applied it in my thesis by looking at the government of Manitoba, Canada. And I did a historical study of it. I looked at how did it start, how did it grow, when were different departments at it, how long did they last, how big did they get, and why did they decline, and why did they die, and what else, and so on. Trying to think of it as an organism. And then I thought, okay, if I were to set up a strategy for recognizing that living organism, the government, this whole government, what should the architecture be like? And so I mapped that out, and I mapped out all the buildings and where the buildings, when they were built, how they were doing, which ones were healthy, which ones were sick, which ones were in decline, which ones were still doing well. And I kind of postulated, if this is an organism, what part of it needs to be rejuvenated, what part needs to add an arm, what part needs to do this and that, over a 20-year period. So it wasn't just, what are we doing now and what do we have to do 2 years from now? And so I designed a building that was meant to be what I would call non-specific, multi-strategic building. That was designed to be able to survive over the long haul with its major investment intact, so that it looked at this notion of differential obsolescence. If you look at a building as a living organism, and you think of the different parts, each one of the parts has their own useful lifespan. Like these lights here need to be replaced every so often because the bulb breaks out. But that's fine, that's not a big deal. You go out and replace a new bulb. But if for some reason this wall wears out, you got a big problem. Or if the mechanical electrical system in that closet ends up becoming obsolete, it may need to rewire the whole building and you end up with huge mass that it may not be worth it. You may just want to tear the building down. So I looked at each one of those subsystems within a building and I said, okay, which ones are permanent, unchanging? Which ones are sort of medium range and need to be changed after what period? Is it normally 5 years? Is it 7 years? Is it 10 years? 20 years? And how do I design that building so that those systems can be updated without having to tear the building down, or without a huge investment, so that it becomes an organism that where the parts can successfully grow and change and be updated with new technology. And the permanent part of the building, the permanent investment continues, like this, usually the structural system, the stairs, the stair towers, a number of other elements that were considered to be unchanging and permanent. And so because I did all this thinking and all this work while I was a student, when I was hired after graduating, and I presented all this to the office that I was hired in, they said, okay, great, we'll make you in charge of programming and that whole part of our operation, because you're thinking in those terms already. You're already in that mode. And so the paper that I gave you was something I wrote for the office shortly after I started working there. And a lot of it was sort of parts of my thesis that I had written as a graduate student. And I had a chance to present it at conferences and things like that. But it became our marketing, one of our marketing tools, one of our marketing pitches. When we went to a prospective client, we said, we can talk to you about the investment you're making in your building and how you can maintain your investment over a long period of time without having to worry too much about what's going to be down the road 5, 10 years from now. And we will program the building in that way. And so I had this idea of looking at space not in the specific, but in the generic. So if you think of spaces and you divorce it from the type, like something is called an office or something is called a classroom and so on. If you get rid of that label and you think of it in more generic terms, this room here that we're in could very easily be an office. You take these chairs out, you put in desks, and maybe you have to change the lighting and do a couple of other things and you've got an office. So there's kind of a generic type of space here, which I identified as one of the generic spaces. And if I can get this thing back up, I don't know what. Okay, I'm going to go to that chart. All of this is sort of leading up to what I was just saying. And hopefully you've read it, and I'm going to ask you for sort of comments and questions in a minute. But okay, here's this chart. Kind of summarizes what I'm just starting to talk about. These are the basic multi-strategic spaces that I've kept encountering in projects. There's what I've called an industrial type space. In this case, because we were doing a lot of laboratory buildings of different kinds, there was something called a lab space. And then there's a classroom office type space. So they have sort of general characteristics in common. So if you're designing a building, you design a building with a certain percentage of type A, type B, and type C space. Now that means that if you have the right mix, over time, the particular function in that space can change. And this happens all the time. We see strip malls that at one time were, maybe it was a little store, next time it's something totally different. Gas stations become restaurants, on and on and on. There's this whole cycle of buildings being repurposed. And usually it's done with great expense and great difficulty. But it could be designed into the building. And so this is an attempt to do that. So in the School of Architecture building, you maybe don't have to get hung up about, is this space going to be an office space, or is it going to be a classroom, small seminar room space? Is it going to be this, or is it going to be that? But is it this generic type, and how much of that type do we need? So if we look at that atrium out there, that atrium is perhaps a little bit more like this industrial type space. And if we really wanted to, we could go that space out there one day. It could be a mass assembly space. We just need to bring in the furniture. It could be a space like we had the other day over in the north atrium. We had all the tables and the displays and everything. It could be a jury space. It could be, so there's a lot of different things. But there's a range. It's not anything goes. The space is appropriate for a number of strategies. Multiple strategies, but there's a limit to it. And so one of the things you could do as a programmer is you could identify for the type A space, these are the kinds of things that you can accommodate. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then you've got the flexibility for the building to accommodate changes, especially if you design it in a loose fit manner. The idea of loose fit architecture was something that came out in the 1980s, where people were saying, the problem we have with architecture is it's too tailor-made. That was part of the whole project of modernism was form follows function. You tailor-make buildings precisely. And that caused all kinds of problems. It caused a lot of buildings to have to be torn down prematurely before their the amount that had been invested in the building, the amount of latent energy in the building, and so on, was expended. And so there was a loss there. So what I looked at here was, what are the characteristics that we can identify in multi-strategic spaces that they have in common? And it was things like the ceiling height, the capability of the floor to hold certain amount of weight, planning modules, and planning modules aren't always needed, but they tend to be a very useful device, particularly in things like office buildings and so on. What kind of accessibility? How easy is it to get into the space? How big an opening do you need? Does it have to be at the ground floor? And so on. What kind of lighting? One of the big issues with our multi-strategic space out there is the lighting wasn't really developed and thought about. Because one of the things you want to do is, where necessary, you want to be able to darken the room. You want to be able to change the lighting level. You want to go from daylighting to artificial lighting. The same thing is true with sound, the acoustics in that space. You want to be able to have a quiet area. You want to be able to have good acoustics, the right kind of reverberation time, all of that stuff. For some of these spaces, that's more important than others. The amount of fresh air that comes in might have to do with how many people are in the space. So if that space out there is totally full of people, everyone's sitting in a chair, and you've got 600 people out there, you have a bigger cooling load than normally when it's just sitting there. And you need to be able to have that fluctuate. And in some spaces like lab type spaces, and lab in a kind of generic sense here, might include parts of your studio. That's where you start to have to worry about how much, whether you have to have water, drain, and electrical, and what kind of electrical, And in these days, whether you need wireless, you need different kinds of communication in those spaces, and so on. So that was the approach I took to programming. And so in doing coarse-grained programming, the coarse-grained programming was all about programming the multi-strategic spaces. And whatever absolutely tailored spaces there were, which tended to be not that many, the really custom spaces that had to be in there. And then the fine-grained programming would take this particular instance of this building that you're programming in this short-term time frame and developing all the information that's needed. What kind of furniture are we going to need for the next 5 years? Recognizing that 10 years later, that furniture is gone and there's a whole new different thing going on. But the space that we programmed easily accommodates that. It isn't only work for that type of furniture or that particular situation. I guess we're going to start this here. So that's really the heart of what the pitch that I was making, and that clients actually like, particularly institutional clients. Now, if you're a developer and you're trying to get your money back as quickly as possible, this does involve a little bit of extra investment because you're making your spaces maybe a little bit bigger, you're making them maybe a little taller, you're making them a little higher quality because you're planning for the basic infrastructure, the basic space to be around much longer. So this kind of what I call time consciousness, or thinking actively about time and architecture, is only now, in the last 10 to 20 years, become really prevalent. Prior to that, no one really paid any attention to it, I don't think. I mean, it wasn't in the consciousness of architects. Clients might have asked for it occasionally, but mostly the exercise was to create a really nice building the day it opens for all the photographs and for publication in the magazines, which is kind of cynical when you look at it, but that's what you were rewarded for, because architects do not get a retainer to continue to nurse their building over the life of the building. And that was one of my other pet peeves. I thought that design didn't start with opening day. Design continued with this building modifications, building adjustments, as the building ages and adapts to its, remember, as an organism, it has to go through this homeostasis process of adapting to its environment as it lives, let's say. And how do you do that? What kind of expertise do you need? So the department that I was working in the government was called Space and Planning, but our job was to be that group of architects who kept the patient alive and healthy. So we were constantly monitoring whether the building needed something to happen to it to make the people working in it more productive, more happier, and because it turns out that the productivity of the people in the building is a much bigger cost issue than the building, whatever little improvements you have to make to the building. If you have to improve the lighting, that's a small cost, and the big payout is that everybody is much more productive. So regardless of what the enterprise is.
Oh, there it goes again. Yeah, it's weird. It's like it's flashing like
Yeah.
It times out.
It times out.
That's how I try to steal the lines.
It's trying to tell me something. That I just wanted to give you that background. So you guys have read the paper, right? All of you? Anybody want to comment or present an alternative view or suggest what I could have added to it or where I was maybe, don't be shy. I don't have things hidden. But I do have to have, even though I did this 40 years ago, I wouldn't change anything.
Do you think that if there were theory about design modification be applied to as architects continue with the building? Do you think that's being existent now or still kind of even with
Yeah,
that
it
improvement?
is. It's called
Thank
facility
you.
management. And we have started a graduate program in facility management. I chair the committee that's setting it up. Ron Lumpkin has done most of the work on it so far. And when I was running the architecture and government industry graduate program here at the school, that was our big emphasis, was on preparing architects to manage buildings either like either as an in-house architect or as a consultant on retainer, so that it's sort of like a doctor. You just check up on the patient, you prescribe something to make it healthier, and you do it periodically. You go in and you just make adjustments and things. And then occasionally there's a major problem. You got to add something in addition to the building, or you got a major reorganization of the building or something. But there's no reason why architects shouldn't be very much involved, because it's about space. Yeah, come on.
Do you, as an architect, go back to checking out the buildings that are designed?
Unfortunately, most of them are in. I do have a few here, like the Meals on Wheels Elder Care Services. I designed their buildings, the big kitchen that puts out all the Meals on Wheels. Because I had a lot of experience in industrial kitchens, so I was hired to do that. And I was volunteering there for a long time, and I was for 8 years I was on the board of directors, so I kept right up with that one. There's maybe 3 or 4 beach houses and some other houses and some other smaller projects. Most of the residential stuff I do, I get invited back to their house for parties and things, so I can see what their
Yeah.
other houses are doing.
Yeah, it probably depends on the relationship.
That's your husband.
Yeah.
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Last class, one of the things that we brought up was this idea that there would be a required physical space, but then it might also be on the part of either the program or the architect to talk about like a psychological space that's needed and an expansion of that. And that was one thing that I felt like, because we'd already talked about it, and then reading this was maybe not addressed. And here's
Right.
what, when you're thinking about something as an organism and living, then you've got to think about that it's got this psychological component. And so a lot of this still seemed to be focused on the technology and the minimum requirements of what's needed for a person to do an activity, but not necessarily how they might feel within that space when they're performing that
That's
activity.
a really good comment. I agree with you, because the spirit of the times was, that was height of modernism, 1960s, 1970s, early 70s, mostly the 60s. And everybody was thinking about function. And that was the only
That was the big
conversation
part
that was
of it,
going
yeah.
on. And to think about something as wishy-washy as psychology or how people feel, that wasn't in the discussion. And it was interesting to me because I had to take I was in this period of time in the 60s when we were really heavily into interdisciplinary studies and interdisciplinary design, so I had to take courses in philosophy and psychology, economics, and a whole bunch of subjects. And everybody was trying to incorporate those things into architecture somehow, but not figuring out how to do it. We had courses in urban sociology that seemed appropriate because we were talking about small group behavior in urban settings and how the architecture can either support that or create problems for it, things like that. But individual architecture, architectural spaces, the only discussion we ever had was how you're affected by the color of the wall. The whole pink wall in
Right.
the prison cell. We were interested in how lighting created certain moods, but it wasn't really integrated into programming and design. It was like the individual architect, they had a certain sensitivity to how they felt in spaces and so on. They would think about that, but by and large, it wasn't. And that's why we had so much exposed concrete and exposed, raw materials that people were not comfortable with, but architects loved. Was because of that insensitivity. And I have to admit, I was, guilty of that as well, particularly during this period of time. And I still don't know how one formally incorporates that kind of stuff into it. Because you can't really explain it to a client who's totally insensitive to the world around them. If you talk about this space doesn't feel right, they say, what are you talking about? Because they don't even know what the word space means.
Yeah, sometimes I think it seems like you almost need a client that comes to you with that awareness already in mind and as a part of the concept they want, so that it's
Right.
easier for you to sell it. Because I think partly why maybe it's not addressed in things like this, like you said, this is almost like a marketing tool. You've got to kind of come at it from this perspective of we can give you exactly what you need for a cost-efficient manner.
Yeah.
And a lot of people assume that if you start talking about how a place feels or doing things to change it, how it feels, it might involve a change in cost as well, and that it might not be as efficient in cost.
Yeah, and then they think it's a matter of taste, and they don't maybe agree with your taste. They like
Right.
a different range of colors than you do.
Right.
And it gets
Yeah.
really tricky. My wife's an interior designer, and she runs into terrible problems with taste. She has great taste, but her clients very often don't. And how do you bridge that?
Yeah.
You tell them, oh, you have terrible taste. Go with what I like. Don't go with what you like. That's a problem.
Well, could you sell, or since you use that as a marketing tool, could you sell that if this space is this way might increase work productivity or
That's the
something like
way-
that?
Yeah,
we have to sell
that'd be one way to do it. Yeah,
That's the
for
same
sure.
sort of sales pitch, that this is all about efficiency, it's all about return on the investment, it's all about, all these pragmatic, economic, functional things.
Mhm.
It's not about joy and feeling, feelings, And that was the thing that created sort of the demise of modern architecture as something that certainly schools would talk about, and so on, because when phenomenology came along, they were talking about, well, trust your gut and embrace it with your whole being, and not just your rational being, but your emotional being, all of that. Then people started looking at sort of the classical modern architecture and saying, well, that is really meaningless. That is stripped, bare, ugly stuff sitting there in the city that, of course, we don't like it. We were fooled all this time into thinking this was great, but it really wasn't. And all the public was right after all, and we were wrong. So we were, bringing something to the world that they would appreciate one day, but it turned out the other way around. So the other thing I asked you to do was take a stab at trying to use the data sheet, and I wasn't sure what we would do now with that, whether we would have groups talk about, did groups get together and kind of compare notes and see how, because I asked you to do different, each one to do a different space.
We did different spaces, but we haven't had a chance to actually review them together yet.
Yeah, maybe what's most productive is if you amongst the group, I don't know if you're going to scan it or what you want to do, but share it amongst the group and maybe do submit to me maybe on Blackboard either the sheets. I don't want to collect them because then you end up with, unless you have copies already.
Yeah.
I don't wanna take them, I want you to still have them. But if you send them to me with maybe some commentary or some, feedback on what you found in trying to use them, what I'm hoping you do is you design your own. You use it as sort of a launching point to have a certain level of fine-grained information in your final report. And this might help get you started. Or you may decide to use it, you know, mostly with just some small changes. It's totally up to you. But I would be very interested in your feedback because, I mean, I haven't used that programming system for 40 years. So this is like old stuff that I dragged out of my mothballs. And I agree, it's too weighted in sort of functional, technical, pragmatic, all those kinds of things. Because when I wrote the program for this building, for the competition, I tried to get away from all that. That's why I wrote about the building shouldn't be smug. And the building should, I forget what the other terms were that I used, but they were terms that were kind of descriptive of almost a living thing, or things that you don't normally describe a building by. Ostentatious, yeah. Buildings can be described as ostentatious, but there were qualities of buildings, sort of overall qualities. And so, if you're reprogramming this building, starting from scratch, I really would like to see you not go totally in the direction that those forms are, which is, you know, all of the stuff that has to be taken care of, which is almost like pro forma clerical stuff. But to think sort of above all that, and think in terms of what should the spirit of the place be? How should it feel? What should the public think about it when they drive by? Or the neighbors across the street? Or the campus as a whole? How should they feel about it? Should they feel like we're in our own world over here, we're so different, and we're in this weird group that has virtually no relationship, or are we somehow a part of the family? Those are the kinds of things that are a lot harder to kind of pinpoint and for a designer to grasp onto and to respond to. It's easier to deal with how many square feet do we need, but to deal with what should be the spirit of that place, or how much joy should it bring, all that stuff, that's much harder. And many designers don't try to deal with that. They just sort of work their way through in a workman-like step 1, step 2, step 3. They don't step back and say, what am I really trying to create here as a place? What kind of placemaking is going on here? Is it just a series of rooms that work, or is there some magic that's created here? Is there something beyond that? Yeah,
Well, looking at your form, I don't know if programming changed over the years, but your form is not too far from the university. The way they put it together, just the university design is just condensed to one page versus the other got three different pages. But it's pretty much the same way they do it today.
I know,
And pretty much the architect, when they pay architects to do it, all they do is
I know that's what architects do.
give them that format and they just fill it out. So
I was a consultant on several projects years ago, like Ivy Johnson's office and Barnett Bronzak, and all those guys have hired me from time to time, just to be a consultant. And I was always amazed at how simple and primitive their programming systems were. They hadn't really thought about it. They were just using what the AIA kind of promotes that came out of CRS and problem seeking and all that stuff. And they just keep going with that. And,
Yeah, but they get paid real well for it too, so.
no, they don't. Programming, you don't get paid for programming here. It's part of the service, yeah, it's part of the contractual
And
service.
some parts is not,
Really?
yeah, I don't see any projects on campus actually that actually they get paid to do the program. Two different architects really,
Oh, yeah, okay.
and they're paid pretty good too. But they don't get it, but
We don't pay a lot better in Canada.
if they, I can get a permit from the university and fill it out and get paid all that money, why not, you know?
Yeah, that was easy.
Seems like that's a good way to make a
That
profit.
sounds like easy money.
Yeah, easy money. And that's what I'm saying, you know, easy money. When the school can do it themselves, you know.
Yeah, I know. Well, the problem too is that a lot of owners and users and clients think they can do their own program. And they'll put out like a one-page list of rooms, and they'll say, here's what I want. And if you try to deviate from that or question it, they look at you funny like, I've already given you this, just design this building for me.
Mhm.
And they don't realize what else could be brought to the table, that you have some expertise that might make their building different than they ever imagined, but much better. And that's part of what architecture should be. It should be one of these professions where you give the client much more than they ever expected. It's like, if you just care about satisfying them with giving them exactly what they're asking for, you're really not using your professional ability or your special professional expertise. You're just sort of being a servant to them and saying, okay, whatever you say, you got it. And a lot of developers want the architect to be like that. They don't want the architect to suggest anything different. They want, and they'll even come, and I've seen this, where they'll even come with pictures of buildings that they like, and they'll say, I want this building with this square footage on this site, and you're just doing a drafting service, really. You know, you're just following through. And there's at least a couple of firms in town that are famous for doing that.
Famous?
And as a result, they can cut their fees really cheap. And so they get those jobs. And it's really a shame. It's kind of a
One of the things I did like about it, but I also found challenging, was the idea that it was really focused on an activity and not the name of like a room or a space.
right.
Because I think a lot of times, even like in our own studios, we're handed a program and we'll have like a list of rooms that we're supposed to have,
Right.
you know, in our kind of like that one sheet list that you were talking about. And sometimes we just take for granted, okay, a studio is a studio, and so it's, you know,
Right.
it
You don't
should
ask
look or
that.
feel like this. And I think you tend to get stuck thinking about what it is now. Whereas when you think about the activity, and you really had to sit down and think about, okay, let's say we were doing a studio space, what's the activity really going to look like in that studio in the future? It helped us come up with ideas that are different from what we have now, maybe. You know?
Yeah, it's like reinventing the way that whole activity occurs. Maybe a studio is no longer a static space that exists in one location. At one time, we had something here called the mobile studio. When we had a lot of money, we purchased a van.
Where did all that money?
I don't know, but I was in charge when we had all that money. We had this van, and the idea was we were going to make that van into a rolling studio, and we were going to go to different communities around Tallahassee, park in a neighborhood, bring in the neighbors, work with them, do community design services, and we were even going to go to towns, outlying towns. And we did that for a while. I thought it was great. I don't see why a school of architecture shouldn't be a plug-in architecture school, where you have all these trailers that just plug into the building, and every so often, one of them takes off, goes somewhere, works on a project, like squatters. And the students and faculty are there on site, and they really get to know the place, they really get to know the people. And when they're finished, the trailer comes back here, plugs back into the building, and during that time, it becomes a regular part of the building until it takes off.
It's just like a construction company going to a job.
A job
Yeah.
site. Yeah.
Living there, finishing the job, going to the next job, so on and so
So-
forth, come back home.
That's kind of thing that I'm thinking of when I think about reinventing the Bilton School of Architecture. There's been a proposal out there for a long time to have a offshore School of Architecture on a barge out on in the Gulf of Mexico that could float down the coast of Florida or over to Alabama, Louisiana, and kind of dock, and then we could go and work in Mobile or work in, you know, and be there. It would change, you'd have to change the curriculum, because you'd have to be there for like 2 weeks or something, and really get intensively involved, but that, as an architectural education, might be more meaningful than being here, stuck in here where there isn't very much around us to learn from. So, you know, go crazy. I mean, you guys, don't be held down by what you have now and what you're accustomed to.
Your architecture school, Navy.
No. You know, you can look at other models of other, like you're saying, construction companies and how they operate.
Have Air Force One for architecture.
The school goes with.
You know, like rural students,
Yeah.
you know, they go to a town, they set up camp, they do projects for the people there, and it's considered one of the best learning experiences.
I'm still amazed, and they do that with freshmen.
Yeah.
It's not grad students, it's just freshmen with a couple of teachers, and they do everything. Great way to
Yeah.
start off
Right.
your school experience.
There's other models for education in architecture. In Germany, for example, for many years, you had to be on a construction site for 2 years before you learned anything about design. And you had to really understand how buildings come together, what materials are, and how they work, and what they're capable of, and what their dimensions are, and how you join different materials. Then you started designing. Here we do it kind of backwards. You start designing, and eventually, hopefully, you get some construction experience and some real experience out in the field. But by that time, you've been kind of, you may have got off on the wrong track in terms of your understanding of what buildings are like and how they come together. That's why I started this design build stuff here, because that's what I do. I build a lot of stuff. And for me, the most exciting and best time is out on the construction site when they're building something that I designed. And I can see it coming out. And I learn all the problems, find out all the problems with the drawings, all the dimensional issues I didn't realize were an issue. Because my father was a contractor, and he hammered me with that and said, you know, architects, they're okay, they have ideas, but they don't really know how buildings are built. And so he always told me, don't be one of those guys. Any other feedback on the forms or either the paper? No? The other thing, of course, is, you know, in design studio, and I'm guilty of this too, you're really hemmed in. And if you step too much outside of what is expected, it's a big risk. And so unfortunately, the kinds of things I'm talking about, if you were then reject what you're being asked to do in school, in studio,
You get a bad grade.
you don't necessarily, that isn't necessarily a good thing.
And you don't want us to say, Ots told us we could think of it differently.
I know, but when I was a student, there was this whole thing about student power. It was the 60s, and everybody was in revolt. It was the Vietnam War, it was all kinds of stuff. And so we thought of ourselves as a power group. And I happened to be the student president of the class. And so whenever, I shouldn't even tell you this, whenever the teacher handed out a project, we would huddle. We would look at it and say, now is this worth doing? He would hand it back and say, no.
Try again, sir.
Because we were the customers. We were paying for this. We were trying to get an education. We cared about what we were learning. We didn't want to do some villa in we want to do something with relevancy. Because, you know, the mantra was, if you're not part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And
Interesting. Interesting.
had to come back 3 times. You know, sorry, not good enough. Come back.
Interesting.
I don't recommend it.
Yeah.
These are different
Odds
times.
told us to. He said, power to the students.
Yeah.
So how did they react when you said that?
Well, you know, it's interesting, for the younger faculty, they really liked it. They agreed with the whole idea. The older guys who've been around a long time, they have real problems. They felt threatened, they were insecure about it. They thought, you know, because of their age, they knew better than we did.
Guys, let's do this. Rollins, you're getting us South Monroe, you're gonna get us Thomasville, what are you doing? I want the ball and I'll take nothing less. I'm with you. Live up to get up on. All right.
You know, it got to the point where some faculty would sit down with us prior to framing a project and discuss in a workshop, well, what should we do on this next project, guys? You know, and we would talk about different ideas.
That kind of sounds like a nice framework, actually.
Yeah, that was a good experience because it brought out what everybody's issues were, what they believed in, what they were passionate about. And if you're passionate about what you're doing, you're going to work harder, you're going to believe in it, you're going to do a better job. Okay, so send me your data sheets somehow with some commentary from your group. So I guess one person in the group would collect them and just scan them and send them.